Yes, thank you, Behang. Um, Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. This is really a great moment for me, this whole conference that this participated. I was working for that. I was dreaming of that for many years. I was working for it for a year, and it's really been a very great conference. So thanks for all of you being here today, and also for those listening online. And I would like to bring to the fore now Rudolf Steiner, who has been in the background of this conference, hovering about it, above it, or whatever. And I want to bring it a little bit more to the fore. It's certainly not easy to talk about Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner is known as an esotericist and anthroposophist, and of course, as the founder of Waldorf pedagogy and anthroposophical medicine and biodynamic farming. He was also a philosopher, and he wrote about Goethe, and he provided a very peculiar interpretation of Goethe's idea of metamorphosis of plants, or in general of his morphology, of his natural philosophy. And I would like to try to point out a specific point which I think adds something to all the different aspects which we have been already discussing during this conference. Very briefly, I mean, I don't have to tell you about Goethe, that he was an eminent natural scientist, but Rudolf Steiner was the editor of, one of the first actually editors of Goethe's natural scientific writings. He was only 21 years old, being a student at the Technical University in Vienna, when he was asked whether he would take the, the well, it was more than a job, take the task to edit Goethe's natural scientific writings. And he was very enthusiastic about it. And 2 years later, or 3 years later, 1884, he published the first volume. And then 3 additional volumes until 1897. And each of these volumes has an extensive introduction by Rudolf Steiner. And the first introduction to the first volume, he just starts with the morphology. He was free in ordering in setting up the order of Goethe's scientific writings, and he starts with morphology and with commenting on Goethe's morphology and trying to explain what Goethe did. In 1886, he published his first monograph. It's an epistemological analysis of Goethe's theory of knowledge. And in 1897, he sums up his Goethe work, one could say, in Goethe's worldview. In 1940, he dedicated an extensive chapter in his history of philosophy to the age of Goethe and Kant and Goethe. And he also elaborated on his Goethe work in his autobiography in 1924. And during his whole during his whole teaching life, he always again and again referred to Goethe. So Rudolf Steiner's work, which we have nowadays, consists of his books and essays, and then about 350 volumes of hand transcribed lectures, co-stenographed lectures. And he gave about 6,000 lectures, and he talked about many, many different things, and always comes back to Goethe, here and there and there and there. And it's very difficult if you not only stick with the books, but if you want to see what did Steiner all say to Goethe, to really find out, to pick that out of this amazingly huge oeuvre. And we have a small research project at our Cantus Academy, and I just want to make a short advertising for that. I just want to shortly show you what we are doing. We're picking out Steiner's quotes on Goethe and providing them in an internet database. So we are picking out Steiner's quotes on Goethe and sorting them according to different themes. And we did the same thing with Goethe's work and doing that, and picked out hundreds and probably several hundreds of quotations from Goethe on natural science and natural philosophy. The web pages are there. A few starting points which with relation to our discussions. There is one thing is this: there's no Newton of the grass blade. There could be no Newton of the grass blade. So life could not be explained, or the organism could not be explained. That's something Kant posited, argued for, and it has been a question, of course, also during this conference, whether we can really explain this mystery of life. I want to refer to that. Another very important point which relates to what we've been talking about, but also what I want to stress, is that in my opinion, I mean, people say, okay, this is a Kantian, this is not a Kantian. But in my opinion, in my understanding, Kant found out something, or argued for something very fundamentally important, that we have to use concepts to understand organisms. We cannot describe, we cannot understand organisms from the content of sensually perceived phenomena. We have to apply concepts. Otherwise, if we would not apply the concept of wholeness or of internal purposiveness, we would not be able to make any sense at all of an organism. So concepts are conditions of knowability for an organism. And this is in a way different, or it's different concepts that are required to know an organism, of course, than to know a physical object. But I think this is very, very important, that we always have to keep in mind we are dealing with sensual perceptions and with the conceptual realm if we are talking about organisms. So every time you forget the conceptual part, you talk about something, yeah, either physical or spiritual, but you have to consider your own conceptual activity or your own mental activity, which is involved in cognizing an organism. And one more thing, I just want to mention that Darwinism and genetics, they do not explain the organism. This is just an illusion. They presuppose the living organism. Genes only exist within an organism. They cannot exist somewhere else. They only function within the living whole. And Darwinistic selection presupposes this living, self-replicating whole. If there's nothing that lives and replicates, there's nothing to select. So both these, that was a complete illusion in biology, that people thought we can explain the organism now in mechanistic terms by Darwinism and genetics, because they presuppose the organism. And one reason why this is so attractive, or why the illusion is so difficult what makes the illusion difficult to understand that it's an illusion, because if you forget about the conceptual realm, if you just talk about the outside Darwin selection or genes that you find. And a third thing, and this brings me then closer to what I want to talk about, is this idea of knowing life is similar to knowing knowing. Knowing life is similar to knowing knowing. So if we are in the conceptual realm, if we walk around in there, move in there, then it's a sort of a similar structure. And Levi Heck and Gertrudis showed that the problem of knowing life is similar, structurally similar, or epistemological similar to the knowing knowing. And this is sort of a strange thing, because subject and object are the same. So how can we know anything then any more in this, if we are in this position? Goethe himself was not denying the recognizability of the life principle of the organism. I would state that as a thesis. When he said to Schiller in their first famous encounter that there is an approach possible that portrays nature not separately and in isolated parts, but represents it as effective and living, striving from the whole into the parts. Just the opposite of what Kant was claiming. We cannot go from the whole to the parts. Goethe, yes, strives in nature. We can represent nature striving from the whole to the parts, living whole to the parts. And then Schiller said, yeah, this is true, but it's only an idea. He did not say only, but it's an idea. And Goethe said, okay, you may be right, but it can be very dear to me that I see my ideas with my eyes. So for him, it was not only conceptual, but empirical. And this is the strange thing of this strange borderline between what is conceptual, what is real, what is ideal, what is empirical, what is perceivable. And understanding the organism requires to make the conceptual empirical, to make the conceptual perceivable. Goethe wrote the author shares the story of his botanical studies. His quest for the organism, and then he writes, whether it became clear and clearer to me that the view, the Anschauung, could be further enlivened. The view could be further enlivened in a higher way, a demand that I envisioned in the central form of a supersensual archetypal plant. The central form of a supersensual archetypal plant. That was his idea he was looking for. And a year before his Italian journey, or in the summer before his journey in 1786, he wrote to Charlotte von Stein, I cannot express how legible the book of nature has become to me. My long spelling exercises have helped me, and now everything suddenly clicks, and my quiet joy is indescribable. So he describes something that he could see. It is no dream, no fantasy. It is an becoming aware of the essential form, with which nature only ever plays, as it were, and playfully brings forth the manifold of life. It's a becoming aware of the essential form. I can see my ideas with my eyes. I can see it. It's empirical for me. It's not metaphysical, conceptual, ideal. It's empirical. And the question is, how can we understand that? You said some people argue he just had the view. Yeah, he was, he could see it in a way, but this would not be science. And now I want to go with you. When I listened to Craig yesterday, I thought I have to bring a plant today. So, and excuse it, please. It already loses some of its vital power, but this is again interesting in respect to this. Now, what I want to show you, when we just create a short representation of this being, then we see this one direction downwards. Craig has explained that last night beautifully, and the other direction upwards. One goes towards the center of the earth, towards gravity, and the other one goes towards the light, the sun, in the opposite direction. Then along the stem, and Goethe described that not in the Metamorphosis of Plants, but later in his essay on the spiral and what is it? The vertical and the spiral tendency in the plant kingdom. We have a vertical tendency of the annual flowering plant. And we have a spiral tendency in which the leaves, the organs, are organized along this vertical extension of the plant. And if we look at the leaves now, there could be many things described about it, but one thing I want to point out, which was central to Goethe, the leaf starting from the cotyledons down here, and then it starts to expand. It becomes bigger, maybe it becomes more differentiated. And when we move further up, we see that it slowly becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Can you see it still here? It's still here, but it's almost gone. So this is what Goethe described as the tendency of expansion and contraction. And then it expands again, it contracts very much similar, analogous to the seed in the bud. And then the bud opens and it contracts again in the petals in the flower and expands and contracts in the reproductive organs. And then it expands again in the fruit and contracts in the seed. But this is not all, because, and this was more of implied by Goethe, but it was described by this contemporary, don't know his first name, Voigt, botanist. He described it as these three cycles of expansion and contraction are not similar or are not the same, because in the first cycle we have an expansion and contraction in a successive manner. In the second cycle, the petals in the reproductive organs expand and contract simultaneously and adjacently. So successive and then adjacent. And in the fruit expands and the seed contracts, nested in a nested fashion. The fruit is the expansion, the seed is the contraction. Now, if you followed this, and if you now surely recapitulate this, okay, now one could ask, would there be a further cycle of expansion and contraction possible? Simply from a logical point of view, no. So the whole cycle has to begin anew, because it's a spatio-temporal logic according to which the whole development of the plant is organized. Expansion and contraction. I leave out the vertical and the tendency now. Yeah, we put that in the background. We have expansion and contraction successively, adjacently, nested, and then we cannot have another spatio-temporal thing. Now the two principles would have to separate. The plant expands with the seed, the contracted seed expands, and then the cycle starts anew. So we have an inner logic, a complete logic of the annual flowering plant. And Goethe said, the archetypal plant, that's what he wrote to Herder in 1886, the archetypal plant will become the most wondrous creature in the world, the one for which nature herself will envy me. With this model and the key to it, one can then invent plants ad infinitum that must be consistent, that is to say, they may not actually exist, but they could exist and are not mere pictorial or poetic shadows or illusions, but have an inner truth and necessity. This is a very, very interesting quote, because he differentiates the idea of the archetypal plant into two elements, a model and a key to it. And very interestingly, Eckhard Förster explained or analyzed this notion, and he argued or he explained that we can understand the model as the element of the plant which goes through all this metamorphosis, which is the same in all these different organs, which Goethe famously called, and I will come back to that in a minute, the leaf. The leaf is that which expands and contracts. So that's the proteus, the principle, the leaf. And the constructive rule is the key. The key to it is the constructive rule. So we have a constructive element, the leaf, and we have the constructive rule, 3 cycles of expansion and contraction in a successive, in a gesteigerte way, successively adjacently nested. And Förstersen writes, with these 2 elements, with the constructive element and the constructive rule, construction of the plant in inner intuition, whose governing law can then be rediscovered in outer intuition, is possible. It is possible to construct the plant in inner intuition and then rediscover its law in outer intuition. And this is what Kant claimed to be proper science. You have to construct something in inner intuition and then prove it in outer intuition. So what about the leaf? Is that sort of nevertheless not a completely logical concept? Is there something contingent in the idea of the leaf? The Goethean biologist Andreas Suchanke wrote about this question in a small essay in 1983. Goethe's leaf, Goethe's idea of the leaf is the idea of a living surface that exchanges substances, transforms substances in relation to its environment, in relation to air. Greg described that yesterday. CO2 is being transformed into carbohydrates, water, sunlight, the elementary surroundings. And the leaf can be understood as a living surface in which or through which these biochemical and biological processes are being done. So that is a conceptualization of the leaf, which is completely transparent now. Now we have a living surface, restricted. Okay, we need to add the idea of restriction. And then we can think about the plant of constructing it. This living surface expands, contracts, expands, contracts, expands, contracts. And then we have constructed the plant if we also include vertical and spiral tendency and some more things, the influence of the environment and so on, then we have constructed the plant in inner intuition. Now, Steiner, in this book, which is called in English, Nature's Open Secrets, and which contains the 4 introductions to Goethe's natural scientific writings, Steiner describes in his first introduction the difference between inorganic explanation of inorganic phenomena and explanation of organic phenomena. In inorganic phenomena, the content comes from sensual perception, and the concept is the form or the means by which we explain the connections between the phenomena. Take a flame, take a pot of water, take a mercury thermometer, and put them together, have them interact. So this is all sensual content, sensually perceived content. And then we add the concept of causality. And by that, we explain the change in the thermometer. So the content comes from sensual perception, while the concept is a means, is a form itself, not contentious. It doesn't have a content. It just explains the connection of the sensually perceived phenomena. And Steiner now writes, in the plant, in the organism, all sensory qualities in an organism appear as a result of a higher unity hovering over the sense-perceptible processes. It is not the form of the root that determines that of the stem, and not the form of the stem that determines that of the leaves, and so on. All of these forms are determined instead by something that exists above them, and whose form is inaccessible to the senses. The perceptible elements exist for one another, but not as a result of one another. Here, what we perceive with our senses cannot be reduced to other sensorial factors. We must include in our concept of events elements that do not belong to the world of the senses. We must conceptually grasp the unifying principle. In principle, this is the same idea that Kant expressed. We cannot explain how a whole determines its parts, because a whole is a concept. And I also included this quote because Steiner says here, the perceptible elements, so the leaves, the flower, the fruit, the root, they exist for one another, but not as a result of one another. And the longer I deal with this question, I become more and more sensitized to this on and on repeated Kantian notion that the organism is cause and effect of itself. If you really think about it, it's true, but it tends to be interpreted that we have causal relations. Just the difference is that it goes forth and back, but it's still causal. But it's not causal, it's conditional. And this is a great difference. Genes do not cause the organisms. Genes are a condition of the organism. So I think, I mean, if you really look closely at Kant, he does not really claim that, but I think it tends to be misinterpreted or to lead into misguided interpretation, that the organism is cause and effect of itself. No, it's condition. The organs are condition of each other. So Steiner claims that we have to explain, if we want to explain, we have to go beyond what we can perceive through the senses. And he, in his sort of imaginative way of describing this thing in language, says it's hovering over them. He always uses these spatial expressions to express something which is ideal or spiritual, which you have a hard time in putting in words otherwise. A principle which we have to grasp conceptually. When we are in this position, when we have put ourselves in this position of being aware that we have to deal with the conceptual realm, we're dealing with the conceptual realm if we talk about organisms, and we have now taken the idea in that we have to find this principle in the conceptual realm, the view turns back on itself in a way, and it turns back onto our own thinking. How do we grasp this principle if it is not to be just an abstract concept? And Steiner further claimed that, now I need to find that here, our mind must work much more intensively in grasping the organic type than in grasping the natural law. It must generate not only the form, as in explaining inorganic phenomena with a natural law, which is the form of the phenomena of the content, organizing the content. It must generate not only the form, but also the content. It must generate the content. It must undertake an activity that in inorganic natural science is performed by the senses and which we call intuition, which Kant called intuition. Steiner was very much referring to Kant in his writings, not always quoting Kant, but if you read it, it's very close to Kant, all the argumentation. Our power of judgment must view in thinking and think in viewing. Here, as Goethe first set out, we are dealing with an intuitive power of judgment. We must generate the content if we want to achieve a real explanation of an organism, of an annual plant in this case, equivalent to the explanation of a physical phenomenon, orbit of the stars, by a concept generated in pure intuition. Proper science. We must generate the content, not only the form. And then Steiner is really also quite radical, because he always draws the consequences of that what he is saying and arguing for. The idea of the organism is active as an entelechy in the organism, in the form grasped by our reason. It is the essence of the entelechy itself. It does not summarize experience, it brings about that which is to be experienced. So now Steiner goes back from the, when you provide the content for the concept and view that in thinking, and I will come back in a minute to that viewing and thinking of this concept, and then you look at the plant again, then you understand, then you see, then you know that what you grasp in reason is the essence of the entelechy itself, and this essence brings forth that which is to be experienced. So that means with this mode of seeing, you see the spiritual activity of an ideal or spiritual entity in physical nature. It brings forth that which is to be experienced. Like the law of the laws of Kepler bring forth the movement of the planets, the orbiting of the planets around the sun. I mean, this is a realist, nominalist question, which can be, people can kill each other for that. But this is the argument. What about now the seeing in thinking in seeing, or viewing and thinking, thinking and viewing? I think it's one way to understand that. One way I showed you already, constructing the plant in inner intuition. If you construct a circle in inner intuition, you just take mentally, take 2 points, hold one constant and let the other one move in a constant distance in a plane. Then you have a circle. Okay? Is there anything unclear in that? No, it's completely intuitive. There's no unclear element in that. You have constructed the circle in inner intuition. 2 points, one is flexible, the other is static. Distance is the same. Move it around, let it move in a plane, then you have a circle. There's nothing unclear in it. It's completely transparent. And that is, if you're now awake for what you're doing, one could say you view it in thinking. But that may not be enough to really understand. And I think here something comes in which Steiner only later brings in his interpretation, not in his early work on Goethe and also in his work on epistemology of Goethe's natural science, but when he refers to Fichte. And Steiner refers to Fichte, claiming, very often did that, to Fichte's intellectual intuition. Intellectual intuition, Fichte claims in the second introduction to the Wissenschaftslehre, is the immediate consciousness that I act and what I do when I act. And he means intellectual action, not this. He means acting in the mind. Intellectual intuition is the immediate consciousness of that I act and what I do when I act. It is because of this that it is possible for me to know something because I do it. Our mind must be much more active in generating the plant archetype because it must generate the content, not only the form. Fichte, I know something because I do it. And you know that he was struggling with trying to explain what he was talking about. Because he said most people will have it much easier to think of themselves as a piece of lava on the moon than to think of themselves as an intuitive I, self-intuitive I. Because the thing is, you can only understand this, what he's talking about, when you do it. It's not discursive. You cannot argue for it. You can argue for ages about it. It doesn't help. You have to do it. The mind has to be productive. So Fichte, in one of his many expressions to try to explain it, and this is actually exactly where it relates to what Gertrudis and Levi were talking about, subject and object are identical, and they are active. This is active in itself. It's not, function is an abstract term, but it's an activity. And now the activity is waking up to itself. Where's the condition of that activity? It's unconditioned activity. It's just doing, but knowing at the same time. And Fichte once in another quote in the, how is that translated? The Ethics, the Schriften zur Ethik, oder wie heißt es? I don't know exactly, sorry. This mode of seeing is immediate and creative life in itself, a force with an I inserted. A force with an I inserted. The absolute identity of seeing and living. And in the second introduction, he also says, within this intuition, there's life, outside there's only death. So it's very interesting that he even refers to life in this intuition. Yeah, not only to mind and spirit. It's immediate and creative life in itself, the absolute identity of seeing and living. Reality is, now once more, here according to this claim, reality is produced in the act of seeing. Reality is produced in the act of seeing without the use of any other organ, produced as reality, not as a mere image. So this is what Steiner later referred to as spiritual perception. It is perceived without any other organ. It's just perceived an activity which perceives itself in itself, an unconditioned activity. And when you take this activity now and use this mode of awareness, of self-awareness, and follow the construction of the plant with that, yeah, redo the construction of the plant, but with the self-awareness of a force with an I inserted, then you are in the creative intellectual principle of the plant. You envision it, you observe it, You experience it, you see it, you understand it from within. And this is why, in my opinion, Steiner's interpretation of Goethe, it is not so clear from Goethe himself. You can all find that in Goethe. But Steiner's interpretation of Goethe makes it clear that Goethe described the intellectual principle as an empirical object of research, not object, please excuse me, not object in the normal objective sense, but an empirical, accessible principle which can be researched. And now with this, we can go on and research all the different creatures in nature and apply the same method. Craig showed us yesterday so beautifully how that can be applied to the organism in its environment. It's just this method. We could see it with our eyes, you were explaining. Steiner puts a little more spin to it in arguing that when Goethe followed the plant and used the leaf as the constructive element, this is not a word of Steiner, an expression, but of Förster, as the proteus, the ideal archetypal element, you have to have living, dynamical thinking to follow the metamorphosis of the plant, of the organism, of the leaf. You have to be able to change your concepts. When you have rigid concepts, you see a leaf, you see the stem, you see the calyx, you see the petals, you see the sexual organs, you see the fruit, and nature falls apart into many different parts. If you have flexible and dynamic thinking, you can follow the metamorphosis of the plant. And what is flexible thinking? It's made flexible by your inner activity. So by following nature with your inner activity, you can start to read its inner principle. And Goethe, of course, said that in a very beautiful way, summarizing probably everything that we have talked about. If we can see an object in all its parts, grasp it correctly, and bring it forth again in our minds, bring it forth again in our minds, then we may say that we intuit it in a proper and higher sense, that it belongs to us, that we have attained a certain mastery over it. Thank you very much.